Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel. I am Chang-Hoon, a moderator, and I'm working at the Asan Institute as director of the Asan Nuclear Policy and Technology Center. Today, this panel will discuss a hardest nut to crack at the moment under the title of China and Nuclear North Korea. Oh, please do not misunderstand me. I didn't mean that China is the hardest nut to crack. Anyway, there has been a lot of good news and bad news in this year, 2012. First, we had a news that from North Korea and the United States, that North Korea and United States made a reciprocal statement on 29 February 2012. But suddenly, North Korea declared that it would launch Gwanmyeong-sung 3 just a few days before the opening of the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit. And finally, on 12th of April 2012, North Korea launched the Gwanmyeong-sung, and this launch led to the demise of the 29th February reciprocal statement made by USA and North Korea. And at the end of, in the end of May, if I'm not mistaken, North Korea put the term nuclear weapon state into its newly revised constitutional law. The preamble of newly revised constitutional law. And furthermore, recently, North Korea declared that it will launch Gwanmyeong-sung again within this September. Given the series of these embarrassing events conducted by North Korea, I think it is inevitable, that the key players in Northeast Asia will pay great attention to the role of China in dealing with denuclearization of North Korea. Today, I've got several fundamental questions for the panelists. The first question is, how have different actors handled the North Korean nuclear issue? And the second question, what differences might emerge under China's new leadership? And the third question, how might China's new leadership attempt to resume the six-party talks and encourage other neighboring countries to participate? And finally, what will be the perspectives of the different actors in the region with regard to China's North Korea policy? To discuss these questions, we have four distinguished and excellent panelists. Next to me, Mr. Thomas Plant. He is research fellow at the International Center for Security Analysis at King's College in London. And next to him, Dr. Jonathan Pollack. He is a senior fellow in foreign policy and acting director of the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Well, this Thursday, the Asan Institute will host the book launch of his book titled as, Korean version of his book titled as No Exit, which he exhaustively explores the North Korean's nuclear weapon program. And next to him, Ms. Lora Saalman. She is associate at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. And next to her, Colonel Teng Jianqun. We already met several times. Recently, we met in Vienna.
Yeah, the circle is so small.
He is research fellow and the director of the Center for Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. I think most of the audience in this room will be much more interested in the Chinese position at first. So let me start with Mr. Teng at first.
Thank you, Dr. Shin. I think I prepared talking points with 8 pages. I think it will take half an hour for my presentation. I just try to make a best opportunity to make full use of the 5 minutes. I think we use I use three words to describe China's role in North Korea nuclear use. First is a patient observer. Before 2003, China patiently watched the development, of the nuclear issue in North Korea, started from early 1990s, and then China is a mediator from 2003 and 2009. In the 60 years, China, coordinated with other 5 countries, for the 6 parties talk. First, the 3 parties talk I think in April 2003, and then in October of that same year, the 6 parties talk. I think the second stage for China's role, I think, during that period of time, was a mediator. So we are entering a new era. I think the third stage of the North Korean nuclear issue in this region. China is actually an actor, from the observer, mediator, and now the actor. So this is the evolution of our role, Chinese role. So to my understanding, in the at least 20 years. So I think, as everyone knows, according to the IEA and other authoritative organizations of the world, I think North Korea began to develop its nuclear capability start from late 1950s, and with the help of the former Soviet Union. And I think they also another factor is that China, and the Soviet Union did a commitment after Korean War to give the security assurance to North Korea, according to the treaty between China and North Korea. So this is the background for us to understand the evolution of North Korean nuclear issue. During the first stage, China patiently watched the development of nuclear issue in North Korea, at least in the first 10 years in 1990s. And then the active participation of the mediation among all the parties concerned, and then finally the 6 parties talk. And I think there have been several misperceptions on China's role. Even today, we repeatedly asked, by scholars, especially from the Western countries, from EU countries, from the United States, that China should have more, powerful influence on North Korea to persuade that country to give up its nuclear and missile development project. But I don't think, this is correct. There are at least 2 events happened during the previous, 20 or 30 years. One is the breakup of the former Soviet Union. The second is the normalization of relations between China and South Korea. So these 2 events, in my opinion, did negatively impact the relations between China and North Korea. So this sharply reduced China's influence toward North Korea. So I think there are at least 3 groups of views in China, at least in the academic circle. The first related to North Korea. The first is North Korea is a troublemaker. So you can read the opinions, the public opinions on the website that China should abandon North Korea, and even abandon the treaty between China and North Korea, which committed to give security assurance to that country. This is a group. The second group is China should give a strong support to North Korea. I heard some story told by our officials in the ministry. When China strongly condemned the nuclear test by North Korea in 2006. Some elders, some old diplomats, even wrote letter to our Minister of Foreign Affairs, saying that how can you use such a strong word, against North Korea. So this is the second group, and the third group I think still is very important. It's nothing to do with China. So they don't care about the nuclear issue, the missile issue, or any issue in that country. Just let North Korea go by himself. So there are three groups. I think the new leader, in my opinion, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, will give a more balanced policy toward North Korea, toward the United States. I think in at least 20 years, China sometimes go extreme to attach great importance to the United States, to the relations with the United States, and sometimes go to the other side to attach great importance to the relations with North Korea. So sometimes they always moved from one side to another side. So I think this time, our top leaders under the leadership of Xi Jinping, I'm sure will have a more balanced policy toward the United States, toward North Korea, especially in the area of nuclear and missile issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Teng. Yeah, well, actually, he introduced to us the Chinese role as a mediator in dealing with North Korean denuclearization. And as well as he talked about the new leaders' perspectives on denuclearization of North Korea. At this point, I would like to give microphone to Mr. Thomas Plant, because he will deal with the external impacts of the North Korean proliferation issue in the Northeast Asia. Okay, Mr. Plant.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'd like to say at this point, thanks very much to the Asan Forum for inviting me here to speak. It's a great pleasure to be back in Seoul. It's slightly more disconcerting to be sitting next to the man whose book launch you're going to on Thursday to talk about his subject. So, Jonathan, I hope I don't commit any massive indiscretions. So, I also have to say up front that my position at King's College London is a secondment from the UK Ministry of Defence, so everything I say here is my own opinion, it's not UK government policy. So, China and nuclear North Korea. What I want to talk about here, really, is North Korean nuclear proliferation issues, and potentially how China might adjust its stance towards North Korea to address this. It was very interesting to hear from Colonel Teng that China was becoming an actor in the North Korean situation. I think that's actually pretty good news. I'd like to acknowledge the work of Ben Rode at the Belfer Centre as well at this point, because he and I have worked together on some of the ideas I'll be presenting today. So what is there in North Korea to worry about? Well, just a quick recap. Obviously, there's a certain amount of plutonium, which may or may not be in weapons form. There's a potential stockpile, I should say, of enriched uranium, ranging from 0 kilograms up to potentially quite a lot of kilograms, depending on what assumptions you make. And I won't go into those here, but I think the point is that there could actually be a reasonable amount. And then that's not to forget the total fuel cycle capability that North Korea has developed, right through from mining, milling, conversion, enrichment, reprocessing, operating reactors, all those things that a country looking to develop a nuclear capability might actually want a one-stop shop for. So North Korea actually has quite a lot to offer. But would North Korea really sell this stuff? And would North Korea really sell it to non-state actors, which is one of the key things that I want to come back to at the end of this talk? Well, let's take states first. There are two examples that we know of in the open source, obviously, the cases of Libya and Syria. Who knows what we don't know as well? That suggests it isn't as unlikely as you might think. And actually, if you take the time since the beginning of the agreed framework in 1994, North Korea has spent more time proliferating than it has not proliferating. So, I mean, if you're thinking that this is an unlikely scenario, well, history suggests otherwise. So let's take these in turn. Well, Libya. So Libya has had an established defence sales relationship with North Korea since at least the 1970s, and perhaps before that. There were reports of ballistic missile sales as well, so you have this conventional weapons, then ballistic missile sales issue. Now, a key entity in that relationship is an entity, the pronunciation of which I will now murder, and I apologise for that, Chang-Hoon. I'm going to call it COMID from now on, Korea Mining Industrial Development Organisation. And that's an organisation that was pretty key in setting up that relationship in the first place. Now, when Gaddafi abandoned his nuclear program in 2003, it was subsequently discovered that nearly 2 tons of UF6 had come into his possession from North Korean sources in between 2000 and 2001. Now, some journalists did some work to uncover the reported cost of that, which was $2 million. If you do the maths, that's about 40 times market rate. And what Gaddafi was actually looking for at that point was around 20 tons of US6. So $20 to $30 million worth of $20 to $30 million would have been spent on a moderate amount of feedstock for a program at that point. So bear all those factors in mind, the kind of long-standing relationship, proliferation entity, and the high cost of this material. So let's look now at Syria then. Again, you have a defense relationship that significantly predates any reporting of a nuclear relationship. Scud-B sales in the early 90s, Scud-D capability in the early noughties. Again, you have the involvement of Changwang-Xingyong, or COMID. So in 2007, the destruction of a facility later assessed to be a nuclear reactor at Deir al-Zor kind of blew the Syrian nuclear program ambitions open. The involvement of North Korea was evident from the design feature of the reactor and also from the association between Ibrahim Othman, who was the head of the Syrian Atomic Energy Commission, and Chon Chi-poo, a senior North Korean nuclear scientist. So other research gives the likely early construction of that reactor as the early noughties. 2002, the reactor was reportedly under construction. So you have, again, a kind of a long build-up into a nuclear relationship from a defense relationship. So what conclusions can we draw from that? Well, nuclear proliferation appears to be made possible by the connections that North Korea makes in its conventional weapons sales relationships. And this is a pretty important result, because if you only look at nuclear proliferation, then you miss the majority of the story. In fact, it's these weapons sales that actually enable the thing that we're all concerned about to happen. So if you're ignoring the weapons sales, as China appears to be, then you're not actually preventing any form of nuclear proliferation at all. In fact, you're aiding it. Second point is that proliferation of incentives to North Korea doesn't necessarily reduce proliferation risk in this environment, because both of those instances happened at times when North Korea was receiving tremendous benefits, or let's say not tremendous, but significantly enhanced above the baseline benefits than it would normally receive. So Libya relationship was during the agreed framework, and Syrian relationship was during both the agreed framework and the six-party talks. So it seems that because of this, North Korea has a high-risk appetite. And if it can proliferate, it will, but seeming only to long-standing customers who have the means to pay. So what about non-state actors then, the extra concerning aspect of this? Well, it's a zero-data case, which is probably a good thing. The Libya case suggests that the North Korean price is going to be too high from the majority of non-state actor groups. However, both the states with which North Korea has had a nuclear sales relationship have had associations with terrorist or non-state actor groups. So it's not too hard to imagine a case of second-order proliferation, for example, in the case of Syria to Hezbollah, in an alternative future. So to prevent non-state actor access to nuclear technologies, something which Hu Jintao repeatedly said China was committed to, non-proliferation or counter-proliferation, not just of weapons of mass destruction, but also in the North Korean case of conventional weapons, is actually key. So isn't this just a problem for the US or the West? Well, no, actually. Possibly a slightly predictable response, because if I'd said yes, then this talk would have been over right now. Depending on the technology and the recipient, this could be a casus belli for the US. It's important not to underestimate the securitization of this issue in US policymaking circles. And that kind of outcome is only going to be negative for China's regional security situation in the longer term. So what is China doing now then? Well, seeking to maintain influence in Pyongyang, as we've heard, potentially reduced by some other issues, some other aspects of the situation. But it's also shielding North Korea from UN Security Council imposed sanctions, and shielding not just in terms of scope, but also in terms of implementation. I suspect that a lot of this is out of a deep concern in China that coercing North Korea with sanctions isn't the way forward, and actually I tend to agree with that. But what I think the Chinese leadership needs to separate going forward is coercive sanctions from sanctions designed to protect from the risk of proliferation. Those two things are very different, and they need to be treated differently, actually not just by China, but by the other parties involved in imposing those sanctions as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Plant. He was talking about the North Koreans' connection with non-state actors as a proliferator of the nuclear weapons as well as conventional weapons. And he talked about the international community's efforts to denuclearize North Korea, especially from the perspectives of the United Nations Security Council resolutions. In order to make effective UN Security Council resolution implementation effective, he mentioned the major role of the China in this issue. Well, actually, I would like to give microphone to Ms. Lora Saalman because while she is talking about the cooperation between U.S. and China, I mean potential cooperation between U.S. and China with regard to denuclearization of North Korea. So please, Ms. Lora Saalman, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to echo some of the comments that have already been made. It's an honor to be here at the Asan Forum for the second time, and it's also an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. In preparation for coming today, obviously we're talking about China and transition, and I was heartened to hear Professor Teng Jianqun's comments about China taking a more active role or becoming an actor. At the same time, too, he was talking about a balanced role or a balanced position between the DPRK and the United States. And I think that, as we all know, that probably does not necessarily bode well for China supporting U.S. initiatives when it comes to the DPRK. And I hate to be a pessimist on this, but I will be the devil's advocate today to a certain degree. I think that my own position and what I've seen and in the research that I've done on this issue for the past few years, and even with the new leadership, I would say that actually a lot of the overall aims for the party for China remain the same. Those have not necessarily changed, whether it's territorial integrity, economic growth, party leadership, domestic issues. We heard about all of these this morning. And there is a real priority on stability. You probably heard stability. I didn't count how many times this morning. But it's not just the role of one power. Obviously, it's the interaction between China and the United States. Now, just briefly, coming into this, not being Chinese, I engaged in a large-scale amount of primary source literature overview, and also the conferences that I've been attending. And one interesting point I'd like to add is that in finding 384 articles on the DPRK nuclear issue, I found that of that group, ones that mentioned Zhongmei, or just in concert, China and the United States, occupied less than 70 of that entire number. And if you actually look at what they're talking about in those articles, they're not talking about Sino-US cooperation, quite the opposite. So my first major point I'd like to make today is that I remain unconvinced that closer US-China open coordination on nonproliferation will occur, particularly in the case of DPRK, but also in the case of Iran. That's another issue I was looking into in my research. Second, I think the prioritization of nonproliferation and denuclearization remains very different between China and the United States. I would argue that it's a higher priority for the United States than it is for China, and I'll go into the reasons why. My reasons actually can be broken down into three. The first of these is a different mindset that I find in all the research that I've done. Within China, there are obviously three major terms applied to the field that we work in. First of these is arms control, or 军备控制. The second is nonproliferation, 核不扩散, or 不扩散. And the third is counterproliferation, or 反扩散. And if you look at the writings about this, there's much more of a penchant in China to support the first term. In fact, my own advisor, Li Bin, will talk about arms control. He doesn't necessarily like to use these other terms. They're increasing levels of pejorativeness in them. First of all, because arms control is about the obligations of nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Non-proliferation, it's in vogue. You'll still hear it in China a great deal because the United States, obviously, in the Nuclear Posture Review, referred to it at great length. But it's still talking more about the obligations of non-nuclear weapon states and keeping nuclear weapons out of the hands of non-state actors. Counterproliferation, more than any of these, I find, at least in Chinese writings, to be much more pejorative. It's about intervention and sometimes force. So where does this start to diverge from the United States? Teng Jianqun mentioned this idea of a mediator. That's something I see quite repeatedly in all of these things, in all the discussions within China. And China sees itself, at least according to these experts, in a unique position as a nuclear power that straddles two identities, as an interlocutor between the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots. I would argue that that role is becoming increasingly difficult to play the more closely that China hews itself to the U.S. agenda. And that's probably why I think that Teng Jianqun mentioned that about playing a balanced role. China in the past has wanted to avoid isolation, but I think that given its growing status, given the fact that on issues like Iran and Libya, Syria, it has a support generally of Russia, it's not necessarily needing to go along with the U.S. agenda. The second point that I wanted to emphasize is this idea of mutual interests. This morning, a lot of discussion was centered upon this growing distrust between various countries, particularly between the U.S. and China. And I think personally that too much is made of this idea of Xin, the mutual trust. I would argue that mutual interests are much more of a core issue, and there's much more of a deeper and systemic divergence between the United States and China when it comes to nonproliferation and these issues on DPRK in Iran and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, this I can also break down into two aspects. The first is to mitigate crises. This seems to be above and beyond all else what China's ultimate goal is. This is this idea we're coming back to stability, seeking a balance between keeping the U.S. preoccupied, I would argue, and dissuading it from an extreme response. And this is key, that because these extreme responses would harm China's economic and political interests. At the beginning, I mentioned what the core interests are for China. And I would argue that this morning, Jin Sanrong mentioned this idea that China is often reacting to events. I actually would argue that it's not just reacting to events, it's reacting to how the United States addresses these events. What is the U.S. role? And it's that response that we should be paying attention to. I mentioned that 384 articles that I downloaded from the CKNI network within China talked about the North Korean nuclear issue. 2,334 talk about missile defense, U.S. missile defense. Mm-hmm. You can see this huge disparity. Where is the priority lying? And I would argue that it has much more to do about this U.S. response. And it actually bears itself out. If we talk about the six-party talks in August 2003, when China took a more active role as a mediator, in the discourse within China, you found much more reference to 核危机, that there might be a nuclear crisis, or that the whole region might become a 战争场, or a battlefield. And I think that was an impetus for getting involved. We saw it more recently in the Iranian nuclear program and China's response in 2012, this concern over U.S. and Israeli forces possibly getting involved and engaging in an attack. And again, I saw the same types of verbiage used. Mm-hmm. There's also this idea, and this comes to my second point under this, is there's still within China this idea of opposing nuclear coercion. And I think this is still very much prevalent. There is seen to be an existential threat from the United States to a number of countries, whether it's DPRK, Iran, that seems to supplant any questions over the right to nuclear weapons. And this is not a stated policy of China, but at the same time, too, I see it referred to quite frequently. China supports the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it still tends to frame the nuclear issue as between Washington and Pyongyang or Washington and Tehran. And this brings me to the final point, the main thing that I wanted to emphasize. What is the source of the problem? And I would argue that this begs the question of how do you effectively cooperate with a country to stem a problem when you see that same country as the root of the problem? And this is the partner dilemma that we run into with the U.S. and China. The U.S. is most frequently cited in all of these discussions that I mentioned within China as a factor creating or exacerbating proliferation. Mm-hmm. The U.S. pursuit of absolute security, absolute advantage, right? 绝对安全, 绝对优势, is mentioned again and again. The threats that it might pose to DPRK or Iran, nuclear coercion, double standards, preemptive strike, regime change, military intervention, all come out again and again. And I would argue that there's a much greater empathy that I've seen, at least within the discourse in China, of understanding where DPRK, Iran, these countries are coming from. China has been threatened by the West in the past by nuclear coercion. It sees itself as currently threatened by the U.S. pivot to the Asia-Pacific by conventional coercion, I would argue. And this idea of double standards still comes up again and again. So I think that there's still a strong desire to portray a different image from and an alternative to the United States. And ultimately, that will hamper the two countries, I would argue, cooperating on the DPRK nuclear issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Lora Saalman. Thank you very much for your interesting and very illuminating presentations on the potential cooperation between U.S. and China. As the main title of this forum, China Forum, indicates, that the 6 key players in the Northeast Asia are facing with leadership transition. At this very critical juncture, even at this very critical juncture, or taking advantage of this critical juncture, North Korea has been still playing a very dangerous game with their own nuclear weapon program. We have 6-party talks process, but the 6-party talks process, the feasibility of the 6-party talks has already been doubted by the participants of this to this 6-party talks. Given the changes of leadership in the Northeast Asia, I would like to ask Dr. Pollack, what would be the potential, prospects for the 6-party talks in this transition in leadership, and what would be the perspectives of the 6 players? 5 players except North Korea would be in this region.
Thank you, and thank you as always for the Asan Institute for the opportunity to be here in Seoul. Let me offer some cynical views about the 6-party talks. I understand that diplomatic convention requires a certain kind of deference to the sort of code language with which diplomats speak, but without being too mechanistic about it, there has not been a full round of the 6-party process now in more than 4 years. And even though there are obligatory references to it made by one or another of the actors in the process, I don't think anyone takes this process seriously at this point. Even if you assert that ultimately there must be some kind of grand reconciliation, that presumes that at the end of this process, there would be the capacity for all involved parties to sign specific agreements and obligations that would in some measure address the situation. We're not remotely close to that. Now, part of the problem, and I think that this speaks in part to the Chinese role, is that Hu Jintao's era, if you will, atop the Chinese political system, coincides precisely with the reactivation of the North Korean nuclear issue and the commitment that China in particular made to the 6-party process, which in some measure I think was an unusual experiment in Chinese diplomacy. It was really the first occasion that I can identify when China was undertaking a role of a very specific and even active sort as both host of the process and certainly the actor that seemed to have a great deal at stake for its own diplomatic reputation. But I think we have to concede that after that decade, there has been an outright failure of diplomacy to achieve an outcome that all involved parties would deem acceptable. It's a collective failure. It is not just simply a question of what China did or did not do, but the reality is today, unlike 10 years ago, North Korea is now an avowed nuclear state, though one of indeterminate capabilities, and North Korea tries to keep it that way. But that the North has been unequivocal that, and this has been reiterated, of course, since the death of Kim Jong-il, that the existence of their nuclear capabilities is an accomplished, unalterable fact, with North Korea pledging that it will decide what level of nuclear capabilities it ultimately requires for its own security. So the question for now, and I will focus mainly on China as a factor in this situation, is will Xi Jinping and the new top leadership be prepared to revisit the basis of Chinese policy, including its willingness to cooperate with others in an as yet to be unidentified alternative concept for dealing with this issue. This depends in significant measure, I believe, on how China judges the consequences of inaction or versus the uncertainties of embarking on a different course. Even more fundamentally, and I realize I'm not going to be polite about this, is how perturbed is China's leadership about the reality of North Korea as a nuclear-armed state? At the top of the Chinese system, does China really care deeply about whether or not North Korea possesses nuclear weapons relative to other goals that China has in its policy? Or does China deem North Korea's nuclear weapons a manageable issue and not one that potentially threatens Chinese vital interests? Indeed, I would even say, looked at, there are echoes of China's own nuclear history in all of this. The lesson that China might draw is that a state that is determined, despite the obstacles, despite the efforts to inhibit its nuclear capacities, but a state that is determined for its own reasons to go down this path really can't be moved from that path unless you have unique forms of leverage or potential control that would deny it such capabilities. So we have to ask, is when does China's tolerance or crisis avoidance get transformed potentially into something else? China has taken what is an understandable course of action. We might call it business as usual, or in the honored American strategic concept, kicking the can down the road, simply because to consider alternative courses of actions seem overly risky. I dare say that in some measure this is part, or will be part, of the way we perceive Hu Jintao's operative political style, and not just on the matter of nuclear diplomacy. Many of the issues that were raised this morning, the sense of deferring consideration of highly contentious issues and the like, certainly has applicability here as well. So what are China's operative judgments about the North's capabilities and intentions? For years, Chinese analysts and scientists heavily discounted the expressed concerns of the United States about the possibility that North Korea might, for example, be undertaking an enrichment program. There was open skepticism about North Korea's technical capacities here, its ability to fashion a nuclear device. There seems to be some evidence now that Chinese scientists, at least, are taking a second look at this proposition. Even as I would say that whether or not North Korea really has a capacity to miniaturize a nuclear device, I will give you a resounding I don't know, because I don't know that anybody knows. But the question still persists, is how consequential would a nuclear capability be beyond the capacity of what we might call a symbolic capability? So there are a number of variables here. Variables would include North Korean behavior itself, both as its developmental logic of its program, its risk-taking behavior, whether or not under a new leadership China could fashion a different kind of relationship, given that it may, as a consequence of its added support for North Korea, may have some bargaining room here that it did not have before. There is, as well, as has already been mentioned, the question of shifts in U.S. policy, U.S.-China relations, whether or not that disposes the leadership in Beijing to think about the North Korean issue differently, whether there's a shifting center of gravity in the Chinese policy process. More optimistically, might China conclude, has China concluded, that over the longer term, North Korea will have no alternative but to alter its course as a function of its own vulnerabilities in the political and economic arena. So I alluded before to what I would like to think of as China's strategic fatalism about proliferation. There are, of course, according to the NPT, 5 official nuclear weapon states, depending on how you count. I guess you now have another, I guess we have another 5? Is that the correct number? But is there a meaningful way that China, in concert with others, can inhibit, prevent, or even reverse the intention of a state to develop nuclear weapons at acceptable levels of cost and risk? All of this, of course, is counterbalanced by the recognition in China, very strong under the previous leadership, and I assume just as strong under the new leadership, that China wants to be seen as a good global citizen, as Zellick referred to China once as a so-called responsible stakeholder. Or are we in this unpleasant situation where ultimately the world as a whole becomes inured and accustomed to the idea that this is a state in possession of nuclear weapons? Will China continue to favor anodyne, cost-free words that are symptomatic, I dare say, of the decision-free context of much of the Hu Jintao era? Or will Xi Jinping view things differently? Colonel Teng has raised some interesting questions that I think bear consideration. Now with Kim Jong-il gone, where the relationship with China was always hugely problematic. But we can't ignore the reality of where we find ourselves today relative to where we were 10 years ago. We cannot undo that history. It is more a question of where we go from here. So, does China, beyond buying time, deem a slowly but unambiguously nuclearizing North Korea as a tolerable outcome relative to other imagined possibilities? Or does North Korean behavior arrive at a point where China must act differently? These, I would argue, will be the primary tests of Chinese security strategy with respect to this issue in the Xi Jinping era. I would just note very much in passing, because I don't want to make this too much a question of what is or is not happening right now, but it is striking that even in this anticipated launch of the satellite, there have been repeated statements of, quote, concern by the part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, acknowledging North Korea's right to peaceful uses of space, but specifically restricted by UN Security Council resolutions, and specific calls on the part of China for North Korean restraint, naming North Korea, which was not the case in the past. Acknowledgements that China has been exchanging views with the North leadership, most recently in the visit of Li Jianqun, new Politburo member who visited Pyongyang, and indications that China has said up front that it would in all likelihood probably support efforts to bring the issue to the UN Security Council yet again if North Korea were to proceed. There's also a very interesting article in yesterday's Chosun Ilbo which indicates that China has undertaken heightened inspections of North Korean cargo that is passing through Chinese ports. So I don't for a moment believe that this is an issue that can be dealt with easily. It's sobering, it's long-term, but I hope in the era that is yet to come, we can all be more candid about some of the factors that explain the bind we are all collectively in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pollack. Well, actually, whenever I think of the nuclear North Korean issue, my general perception is that there have been a certain two stubborn triads in Northeast Asia. The one triad is consisted of China, North Korea, Russia, and the other triad consists of US, Japan, and South Korea. They are competing with each other and making the North Korean nuclear issue never-ending story. Mm-hmm. So, well, when it comes to the six-party talks, well, we couldn't find any solutions by way of six-party talks. At this very moment, I think China should play an actor rather than mediator in order to make a breakthrough in the situation, in the current situation. So I think, well, everybody here in this room noticed that the importance of Chinese role in denuclearization of North Korea. And I will open the floor, and if you have questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself and your affiliations, and then, okay, Mr. Yes.
My name is Xiaohe Cheng from Renmin University of China. Yeah. And I'd like to ask one question first, Mr. Pollack. And one question for Mr. Teng. And Mr. Teng, you mentioned the China now is actors. And what that means, the actors, what the difference is between actors and the mediators? Can you clarify a little bit? And also, Mr. Pollack mentioned the six-party talk, to some extent, is committed collective failures. Yeah, because this is talk, did not stop North Korea from going nuclear. But I'd like to ask is who should take more responsibilities? And can you finger point what the major problems with Chinese policy toward the DPR case, particularly on the North Korea's nuclear issues? Thank you.
Yes, and then I'll take three questions and then yes, give.
I'm Xin-Hong from Renminbi of China, and I would like to raise a question to our moderator. And you said that it's, for China to, in the, next few months, to take as a great actor to initiate some process of, dialogue. What about your next president? Because both candidates in your country now promise to have relatively new, policy toward North. I don't, Jianqun is biding time, and he biding time for 18-party Congress of China, now over, and biding for U.S. election now over. But a big biding is for your country's presidential election. So I don't think that he expected China become actor. He expected that your president, the next president, become actor. And also, another question for my colleague Teng Jianqun. And by what you expect that the Xi Jinping administration will take a more balanced policy and between the United States and North Korea, and what is evidence?
Okay, one more question and then, okay, yes.
I'm Georgi Todoroev from Russian Academy of Science. And I would like to bring in the issue of the satellite launch, of the rocket launch, since this issue is closely connected to the nuclear program. But actually, it's more the US than preoccupied with missiles. Not China, nor other countries, even in Japan and South Korea, are that much preoccupied with this issue. So the question is simple. How do you think China would deal with this issue during the forthcoming Security Council meeting? Will it support coercive sanctions, resolution, or will we settle on some softer variant of reaction? Thanks.
Okay, yes, who will be first?
Maybe we should start.
Okay,
with
yes, Mr. Teng, yes.
Two questions to me. I think actually there are my colleagues and good friends. From the mediator to the actor, I think it's only my anticipation for the new generation of our top leaders. I think, as we discussed, during the previous sessions, actually, Professor Jianqun also mentioned the difference between this generation's top leaders and the previous top leaders. Xi Jinping, I think, we had several discussions with our foreigners in recent weeks, and they gave 3 words to our top leaders. The first is confidence, and the second is pragmatic, and the third is powerful or capable. So these are the words given by the foreigners, not the Chinese. Confidence, pragmatic, and capable. So I think my feeling for this generation will be more active, actively participate in the international affairs and domestic to find a solution to the domestic challenges. So I think one evidence I can give to my colleague, to my professor Shin is the statement by our spokesman of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs related to the missile, or the satellite test by North Korea. Our spokesman said actually North Korea enjoyed the privilege to have a peaceful use of the outer space technology. This is the first time for me to hear such a, a statement by our officials. And the second, that North Korea should abide by the resolutions by the United Nations. So this is just a very simple evidence I can give you to show the more balanced policy by our new generation of leaders. Thank you.
And then Mr. Pollack.
Several questions were asked, directed at me, specifically, what is it about Chinese behavior that has or has not contributed to the problem? And again, let me emphasize that there's plenty of blame to go around here if we judge this a collective policy failure. I understand the reasoning and calculations that China has made because, in part, it has been less a question of what North Korea does or does not do, and more whether, as a consequence of North Korean actions, there is damage done to bigger Chinese interests. If we, for example, go back to the time of the first North Korean nuclear test in 2006, immediately after the test, then Secretary of State Rice traveled to Beijing, where China sought to give the United States every possible assurance, because there was, to be frank, a real fear, I believe, in China, that the U.S. would attempt to pin the blame on China, and that there would be severe political costs for China. So necessarily in that context, China tried to be more cooperative. Tang Jia-xuan traveled to Pyongyang and so forth, playing some kind of a role here and so forth to at least prevent this situation from spiraling out of control. Related to that, of course, is a fear that you never know what those Americans might do under extreme circumstances. I think that kind of an operative logic was also there. So the point here, though, is that China, over time, has made a conscious calculation, and it's one that I can't say for China's own interests necessarily looks invalid, and that is to proffer sufficient political and economic support to North Korea on the expectation that you could arrive at a more predictable relationship with the leadership of the DPRK. This never proved possible under Kim Jong-il. Hu Jintao at various times in his interactions with Kim Jong-il put out kind of a statement of expectations, a wish list, if you will, expecting that there would be, that North Korea would commit to reliably informing China on any urgent matters of international security and the like, which of course they never did. The degree of advance warning for the tests, one account has it that the North Korean ambassador in Beijing was instructed that give the Chinese 30 minutes notice. Just to be prudent, he gave them 20 minutes notice. Things of that sort. So, because for North Korea, as long as the forces that are impinging against it do not so constrict its strategic space, its room for maneuver, North Korea obviously could persist on its course of action. So under circumstances where China, perhaps believing that there is an option, particularly now, to make inroads into the North Korean system, gives North Korea sufficient support, it diminishes the felt pressures that might be there that would really, in some sense, compel North Korea to think of a different course of action, to make a choice, or at a minimum, unambiguously, to slow its movement and its options for being able to do more with respect to a nuclear weapons capability. That hasn't happened. Georgi asks the question of what China might do in the context of a satellite launch, and here it's quite interesting, or attempted satellite launch. It is the case that earlier in 2012, a lot of people, including myself, concluding that the template had been established in 2006 and in 2009, whereby on both of the previous occasions there had been an effort at a rocket launch. It had failed. Whether it had succeeded or failed really was immaterial, because then the Security Council issued, in one case, a condemnation, another case, a presidential statement. North Korea then immediately, reactively said that these are fundamental offenses to North Korean security and vital interests, and they proceeded with nuclear weapons tests. So it looked as if the same pattern might hold in 2012. It did not. North Korea claimed that the Security Council resolution was an offense to its dignity and to its sovereignty, but they never drew a direct implication for national security. So they held their fire in this case. Now, is that a function of pressure that China might have put on the North? I think that there's a credible argument you can make to that, that although China was not going to, shall we say, like a satellite launch, they would tolerate it as long as North Korea did not proceed with another nuclear weapon test or tests. The considered view of the scientific community, I think of Sig Hecker as a perfect example of this, is that in his view, if North Korea really wants to proceed to an operational deterrent, it must test again. It's just that simple. Now, to the degree that North Korea does not test, therefore, another day without another nuclear weapons test can be considered a pretty good day. So the dilemma, as always, is North Korea quietly proceeding with its development, understanding in a more clever way now that, you can make progress, but don't do anything as demonstrative as another detonation or detonations. Hecker could imagine multiple tests. And that's kind of where we are. I mean, it is admittedly not a perfect world, but the question would be, for China's purposes, would this be sufficient? Or does a point come where if you look at the declarations, the statements that North Korea continues to make, that it will improve its nuclear forces both qualitatively and quantitatively without specifying exactly what those parameters might be, does the day arrive that we are dealing with a more consequential North Korean capability and without a realistic means for turning it back? That's the fundamental dilemma, I think, that China faces as we look ahead.
Okay, thank you. And Lora, do you have something to comment on?
Yes, I just wanted to add, coming back to two of the points for the last question that was asked about the satellite test launch. My own reaction when I look at this from a point of stability issues, and then also what I mentioned before on the issue of isolation. On stability, do I think, certainly from all of the reading that I've been doing, all the conferences I've been attending, do I think that this would be destabilizing enough to motivate China to take a really strong hand? And I don't see it being that destabilizing, that it would actually engage. However, I don't see a strong response. However, coming back to my point on isolation, I think that too much is made of U.S.-China cooperation in compelling movement or change on this issue. I would actually argue that Russia could play an extremely important role. We talked about statements, public statements that were coming out. I read a statement that came out or I guess it came over the past few days, I read it this morning, came out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Russia, saying essentially that they wished that DPRK would abide by its UN Security Council resolutions, by its obligations, and that basically condemning, lightly condemning this activity. And I think the problem is in relying on the United States' open cooperation with China on this issue, the U.S. is seen as a hegemon. It's seen by a hegemon by China, it's seen as a hegemon by DPRK. It weakens China's leverage. Who is not seen to such a heavy extent as a hegemon within the region would be Russia. For all intents and purposes, I actually think that Russia would play a much more positive role in this regard. Yeah. Thank you.
Could I say, Lora makes a very important point here, and because if there's one thing China does not like, it doesn't want to be out on a limb all by itself. It looks for partners, if you will, and often Russia has been that kind of a reliable partner. But there's no question but that Russian statements all through the crisis, going back a number of years, have always had a harder edge with respect to North Korea's efforts to develop nuclear weapons than Chinese statements have. And so the question is, might this be a context in which, I don't want to say Russia switches sides, that's a little too dramatic, but where there's enough movement in its stated policy, not to mention in its private activities, that might compel the Chinese also to adjust their policy accordingly.
Okay. Before going to the second round of the Q&A session, if I answer the question directly to me, since I don't belong to any camps of the presidential election, I can't tell anything about that. But, well, actually, Asan Institute is independent institute. But, however, we have to think of two very important facts with regard to your question. The first thing is that North Korea does not have any intention to dialogue with South Korea with regard to nuclear program, to its nuclear program. In this given, situation, in this limited situation, Koreans' role is quite limited. And the second fact is that North Korea is under the sanction of the United Nations Security Council resolutions 1718 and 1874. So if North Korea does not give up nuclear weapon program, it is impossible to expand economic cooperation between South and North Korea. So if we do not think of these two significant facts, then we cannot talk about the prospects of the six-party talks at the moment. Thank you. And then, I will take second round of the Q&A session. So please raise your, Scott. General Pond first, and then, yes, Scott.
It was a very interesting discussion. I would like to make a very brief comments on Jonathan Pollack's question about China's perception of DPRKs and nuclear weapons in the future. I think that if we know a little bit the history of a six-party talks, it comes from three-party talks, and it could even trace back to Geneva 1994 framework agreement. So the nuclear crisis actually, in essence, is a kind of nuclear dispute between the United States and DPRK. And that's why the Chinese actually came up as a kind of mediator, try to solve this issue. And I think the Chinese government has already indicated this is not doing favor to the two countries. It is also in our interest to maintain peace and stability of the region. So I think China has been quite proactive as a mediator before, and it would continue to be a mediator in the future. I don't think the Chinese would change that kind of role of mediating, because we know our efforts cannot replace the efforts of the United States and DPRK and perhaps other countries for the resolution. But if you look at the past records, I think that many Chinese have been frustrated, to see our efforts, only end up with a kind of collapse in the last minute, to wish to reactivate the six-party talks. And we are particularly frustrated by the United States never putting North Korea as a top priority on your agenda. You're more concerned about Iran rather than North Korea. We know that you have been constrained as one reason by your allies. Now, for example, Lee Baek policy and the Japanese policy. And we also know that you seem to be interested that as long as North Korea has been confined to what you call three no's, and you can live up with the status quo. So I think that, Jonathan, is it fair to ask the Chinese whether the Chinese could live up with the nuclear programs while the United States seems to be happy, or at least to be comfortable to live up with the nuclear, it's very, very crude kind of capabilities. So I think that what matters is not really efforts of the United States, of China, although it is significant. What really matters in the future continues to be the attitudes of the United States. That would really determines the pace and the future possibility of the resolution. I think that we are now having a sort of window of opportunity. Now, since Lee Min-bak might soon be replaced by a new president in South Korea. And Japan may also have a new president, hopefully. So I think that this is going to be a new point of starting whether we could do something together. So the question thrown to you is not really about China, but what about the United States and its allies towards that issue? Thank you.
Okay, yes. Well, Scott, we just have 5 minutes, so please be succinct.
Scott Snyder, Council on Foreign Relations. My question is for Dr. Plant, and I'd like to ask him to apply the lessons from the case studies with Libya and Syria to the North Korea-Iran relationship.
Okay,
yes.
Well,
yes.
That's an easy one.
Yeah.
All right, Mr. Plant, yes.
Well, I guess that's quite. I think that's actually both a complicated and potentially trivial answer. So how about I go with the trivial one first, which is, well, actually, let's take the nuclear side, I guess. As far as I can tell, I don't see now, at the moment, any evidence of a nuclear relationship between Iran and North Korea. But what I do see is substantial evidence of the relationships which preceded a nuclear relationship in both those other cases. So I think that the analysis does suggest a trajectory, or at least, I'm not going to say that it's inevitable that if you have this relationship, a nuclear proliferation relationship will occur, because obviously it isn't. There are other countries where North Korea has sold weapons and so forth, and it hasn't progressed down that route. But the fact that remains is that because those contacts are there, it remains a possibility, and it will remain a possibility as long as those contacts exist. Now, as it happens, the Iranian and the North Korean nuclear programs appear to have progressed down different routes, so maybe the window of opportunity for that relationship is actually diminished. They're using different technologies. So it's not, there are factors which suggest it might not happen there. But the involvement of North Korean ballistic missile proliferation, for example, in the Iranian case is significant, because this is, so for ballistic missile technologies and potentially weaponization, if North Korea's got that far, that certainly is an area that North Korea can contribute to the Iranian case. So I guess that's where I see the relationship in those sense. In terms of the lessons for China, one of the questions earlier on was, what are the problems with Chinese policy towards North Korea? And I guess my problem is with this paradigm of abandon, support, or abandon or support, or it's nothing to do with China. Because there's an equation there between supporting North Korea and supporting all of North Korea's activities, which I don't think is actually in China's interest. What I'm trying to argue here is not what I think China should do from my perspective, but that China might actually be missing, Chinese policy might actually be missing an opportunity to de-link a couple of things, things which North Korea is doing that are not in its longer-term interests, and its other interests in promoting economic change, for example, on the peninsula.
Okay, yes, Mr. Pollack.
Sure. General Pan, as always, has posed some interesting questions, and I'll try to give a quick response so that we don't go too long. There is a lot of truth in what you say. I mean, if we look at the U.S.-DPRK relationship, this is the longest-running adversarial relationship that the United States has in the international system, bar none. The United States and North Korea have never had a normal relationship. They've edged towards certain forms of cooperation in limited periods, but it's never been sustained. The question then that people would ask is, well, what's the basis on which you can't make some kind of a breakthrough? There are many factors, I won't go into them. I would, though, note, and this is really what my book goes into in great detail, because my book is really about history. It's not about contemporary policy debate. Even less is it about inside the Beltway debate. It's about the determinations that North Korea, as a state and as a system, and its leadership, made a very, very long time ago to seek not only a relationship where it in effect became an impregnable fortress. That was to deny abilities of either the United States or, dare I say, either the Soviet Union or China from impinging on North Korea's autonomy as a state, its desire to be able to sort of pursue a separate course domestically and internationally. And very frankly, the early origins of the nuclear weapons program, ironically enough, were precisely to find a way to advance towards that goal, even as as North Korea depended critically on the kind of support that it received from both China and the then Soviet Union. So I think that there's a very complicated story here. More than this, I would say, to the degree that the United States can be characterized as an adversary to North Korea, which it is, within North Korea, in a domestic context in North Korea, this justifies and legitimates the behavior of a regime that we should say leaves a great deal to be desired. I think it's understandable that China has sought many, many times to find a way to induce or encourage a degree of change in North Korea. It's one of Deng Xiaoping's great failures with Kim Il-sung. The failures continued under Kim Jong-il. The question is whether the third time will be the charm.
Okay, yes. I'll give to each of the panelists one more minute as a concluding remarks. So first, Mr. Tang, please.
I think in terms of the North Korean nuclear issue, I don't think China will be in favor of such we call it nuclear armed state, not nuclear weapon state. So it's also a challenge for China. So this is my first point. I think the second point I'd like to mention here, China and the United States did have a cooperation in this regard. You know, during the Yanping Island sharing, we sent our state consular to this region. And the United States sent aircraft carrier battlegroup. So this is just to show the two countries just to try to use their influence, no matter it's military, political, but they cooperate well in during the crisis in this region.
Okay, and then Ms. Saalman?
I'd like to just come back to a point that I made earlier about this issue of mutual interests over mutual trust being a core issue or a central issue, I would argue. Because I really think it touches upon several of the comments that were made, and I'm glad someone brought up Libya. You know, and I really do appreciate, and I think the U.S. appreciates the role China's played as a mediator. But when I look at the interests, and I've done some ranking of interests, and I've seen them in official statements and non-official statements, I'm not convinced that denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is in China's interest. I think that there's a large degree of empathy, as I mentioned before, about the issue of nuclear coercion, that it might be used by another state against it. When I look at the term denuclearization, 无核化, and I found that it ranks third, actually, on a list of what gets mentioned the most by China, by Chinese analysts, and others. What I found ranking that at the top was stability. The word stability. Second, survival of the DPRK. Third is denuclearization. Now, and obviously, overarching all of this is what's the U.S. role going to be. Now, if you look at the Libya case, I think we have an answer as to why denuclearization of North Korea could potentially be very destabilizing and actually undermine the first 2 points on that list. So I'll leave you with that.
Okay, and Mr. Plant? And then, yes, Mr. Pollack.
Oh, yeah. I just...
No.
Yeah.
Mr. Plant.
Oh, sure. Okay, that's fine.
So I just wanted to say, actually, because I've spent the most of my time speaking actually saying where I think Chinese policy is deficient in relation to North Korea. So maybe I'll finish off by saying where I think it's actually going in the right direction. And what I think is actually really good is that China appears to be trying to show North Korea different routes to get itself economically, to change the country into something which I think is actually going to be less problematic. So it's actually putting other things than denuclearization first, which I think is very important. But the thing that China really needs to bear in mind is to buy time for that to happen, to ensure stability that can make sure that that will happen. It needs the goodwill and good faith of other members of the six-party talks than itself. Others who might have the capability to upset that route, particularly the US. So making some form of demonstration in relation to proliferation activities in particular might be a sign of willingness to exercise influence in an area that's positive in that way.
Okay.
My closing observation would be that there's no monopoly of wisdom here on the part of any of the actors. I would hope that China and the United States might be able to get to a point where they could have a much franker dialogue and discussion, not just about the specifics of the nuclear issue, but about deeper issues concerning the DPRK as a state, the risks that it may pose to stability on the peninsula and beyond. What do we do, and I do mean we, the United States and China, if under some circumstances we see a system in North Korea that is really losing its coherence. I don't happen to be in the so-called collapsist school. I think that this is a much more durable state than many would acknowledge, but the risks here, frankly, of the United States and China again finding themselves in a situation where they might face one another in a potential conflict, however unimaginable that might be, must be at all costs avoided. I always recall the exchanges between Premier Zhou Enlai and President Nixon in 1972, and where President Nixon made very, very clear, you know, we've been there before with you, and we must absolutely ensure we are never there again. So this is an issue that has layers upon layers. If there's a perception, General Pan, that the United States cares more about Iran, well, you can make arguments either way. The consequences in either case are huge, but in Iran at least, we are not yet at a point, I believe, that an actual decision has been made to move towards an actual nuclear weapons capability, though there are obviously disturbing things that we see along that path. So in North Korea, for better or for worse, unfortunately, nuclear weapons are an accomplished fact, and we have to begin at that point.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, actually, we couldn't find any solution to crack down the hardest nuts in this world.
No exit.
Anyway, yes, it was really interesting and informative discussions. Thank you very much for your attendance.